Welcome to Top Class with me, Duncan Crawford, where we're discussing the global state of teaching. 9 out of 10 teachers across the world are satisfied with their jobs on average, but around 1 in 5 are stressed out a lot by their work. Just 2 of the findings from the new OECD TALIS report, the largest survey of teachers and school leaders in the world. Last year, TALIS, the Teaching and Learning International Survey, spoke to more than 280,000 teachers in more than 50 education systems. It is out now, and to discuss the findings, I'm glad to say I'm joined by the OECD's project manager for TALIS, Ruochen, and also Antonia Wulff, Director of Research, Policy and Advocacy at Education International, a global union federation which brings together teacher organisations and other educational staff organisations from around the world. Thank you both for joining me.
Hi, Duncan. Hi, Antonia.
Good to be here. Hey, both.
So to get things underway, Ruochen, if I can start with you, as you were the project lead for this massive report. For you, when you got all the findings, what was the most surprising finding for you from the TALIS survey?
Given that we administered the survey in 2024, and for most teachers, they had taken it before June in 2024, I was surprised at how many had already received professional development in using artificial intelligence. Governments are not necessarily the most nimble creatures. So when you consider that ChatGPT was released to the public, I think it was November 30th, 2022. So within about a year and a half, governments had already organized and coordinated themselves to be able to offer professional development to teachers in how to use artificial intelligence. That surprised me.
It is a bit surprising, isn't it? Although I shouldn't say that probably that we're casting doubt on the ability of governments to act so quickly. What about you, Antonia? Was there anything in particular which surprised you about the findings?
So maybe let me start by saying that I was pleased to see the teacher shortage feature so prominently in the report. And I think there's a number of more or less surprising findings in relation to the shortage. There's a couple of really worrying findings around well-being, some numbers around the percentage of teachers who report that they've been intimidated, verbally abused. But there's also a number of invitations to policymakers to really address the shortage, and quite a lot of nice, quite tangible suggestions, I think, in here.
Okay, yeah, we're going to get into a lot of these different areas which have just been raised. Ruochen mentioned AI, Antonia there talking about teacher shortages. One of the things which I've perhaps found a little surprising, given that sometimes in the media, the way teaching is portrayed is that everyone's stressed out, people are burnt out, they're sick and tired of the classroom. And actually, the survey finding was that 9 in 10 teachers reporting they're satisfied with their jobs across the OECD on average. Ruochen, you used to be a teacher. Does that surprise you or not? Or do you expect most teachers to basically be happy with their jobs?
That didn't surprise me at all. I think the two circumstances that you talked about, being satisfied and being stressed out, they're not mutually exclusive. If I ask you as a parent, are you satisfied? You would probably say yes. If I ask you, are you stressed out? You would probably say yes. You have a lot of things to do. You're not quite sure how to do all of them. You're just sort of taking a guess in some cases. You want more support.
Good point.
You're pretty satisfied with your role as a parent. It makes you happy. And I think teachers, myself included, I would say that is largely representative of how many people feel. They like their jobs. They like what they do. They believe that it has a purpose. And I think that goes a long way to making you feel satisfied as a professional. At the same time, depending upon where you're teaching and what you're doing and what your situation is, it can be very, very stressful. There can be a lot of demands, and there can be a lot of things coming at you at the same time, and you're not always sure how to respond to all of them.
When you talk about teacher salaries, I'll bring Antonia back in on this, because teacher pay often comes up as a major issue for teachers. And I found this a little surprising, that the share of teachers satisfied with their salaries has gone up in about half of all the education systems being assessed. Antonia Wulff, are teachers becoming more satisfied with their pay?
Well, globally speaking, I don't think the answer to that is yes. Of course, Education International represents teachers across the globe, and that means that we're talking about teachers in about 174 countries. I think in the OECD countries, you see a very modest increase, if that's even a word that the profession itself would be happy with. I think we see a number of examples of governments that have made efforts to look at how to increase salaries, how to increase other forms of compensation, incentives. And what TALIS does in quite an interesting way is distinguishing between job satisfaction in terms of working conditions, excluding pay, which looked better, didn't it? And then satisfaction with working conditions, including pay. And there, I think the numbers were a little less positive, weren't they?
On average, around 2 in 5 teachers are satisfied with their salaries, according to TALIS. In some places, it's better. In some places, it's around 3 in 5 teachers. But certain countries, Malta, Portugal, and Serbia, for example, it's less than 1 in 5. Less than 20% of teachers are satisfied with their paychecks. But is there any way for cash-strapped governments to act on this? What would you recommend?
Well, I'm not going to take on the job of solving the issues of these cash-strapped governments. It's obviously an incredibly difficult landscape at the moment, and we have a recent NATO agreement as well, which increases the pressure on governments to identify funds, and that means that public services, education and health are really on the line, I think. At the same time, I'd like us to take a step backwards and look at what the situation in education looks like and what it's looked like over a number of years. And I think what we see today is that teachers are effectively penalized for going into teaching. So with that same kind of a degree, they could go into other sectors and earn significantly more. And this is something that I think Education at a Glance maybe showed as well earlier this autumn.
Education at a Glance came out this autumn, and it has stats on all things regarding the state of education around the world. Ruochen, I guess the same question for you. I mean, it is raising that in some countries, salary is a major issue, and this does tie in a little bit into the discussion about teacher shortages and how to make sure that teachers want to stay in the classroom. What solutions, if any, are there to try and boost salaries for teachers?
Well, there's 2 questions in there. And I think the most important one is, what is the objective of not just raising salaries, but any kind of policy decision that you make? So the objective that you just posed is to keep teachers teaching in the profession. Okay, so if we look at that, then the question of salaries is becoming a little bit more nuanced. So as Antonia mentioned, in Education at a Glance, they have quote unquote more objective measures. So it's what is your real salary in terms of purchasing power parity, and also how does your salary as a teacher measure against similarly qualified people in other professions? What we ask in TALIS is a much more subjective question. Are you satisfied with your salary? So depending upon the question that you're asking and what your goals are, either one of those could be the most applicable. So I'll give you an example. In TALIS, we did some analysis using Education at a Glance data against TALIS data to see what is the relationship between a teacher's actual salary and their level of satisfaction with their salary. And we saw that there is a weak relationship, but certainly not as strong as you would expect. And we asked just countries what's going on. So in Portugal, which if I recall had maybe the highest real salary in TALIS for their teachers, they also had a pretty low level of satisfaction with their salary. And what we were told is that it's not universal, but a lot of the times Portuguese teachers are not necessarily considering Portuguese engineering or some other field as the alternative. They're considering teaching in Spain, and Spanish salaries are simply higher. So that's where you can see how you can simultaneously have a high salary, contextually speaking, but you're not necessarily satisfied with it because you see an alternative 30 minutes away across the border. So in that sense, if you are the Portuguese government, it's pretty difficult to compete with that kind of national context. So if your goal is to retain teachers, either in the profession or just in the profession in Portugal, then you might have to think about some of those levers that Antonia was talking about outside of salary, because there's kind of circumstances there somewhat out of your control.
I don't want to focus entirely on Portugal, but as you mentioned it, Ruochen, on the topic of aging teachers, in many OECD countries, the aging of the teacher workforce is a growing concerns it could lead to staff shortages. And the average age of a teacher across the OECD is now 45 years old. But in some places, it's much higher, including in Portugal, also in Lithuania and Latvia, where the average age of a teacher is now over 50 years old, according to TALIS. What you were just discussing there is part of the issue that salaries are higher in Spain. So that means younger teachers aren't necessarily coming into the profession in Portugal.
It's a possibility. That particular situation is not something we've looked at. So are young Portuguese teachers teaching elsewhere? So they are teachers. They're just not teachers in Portugal. I don't know. That's not something we've examined specifically, but I think it could be an interesting question.
When it comes to aging teachers, Antonia, how big a concern is that for you? Obviously, I mentioned Lithuania, Portugal, and Latvia there, where teachers on average are over the age of 50. You know, a lot of these teachers are going to retire in the coming years. And if countries don't find enough new recruits, then school systems are going to struggle. So what should those countries in particular be doing to ensure that they do get enough new teachers through school doors?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the piece that worries us here, that in combination with an aging workforce, we see a declining interest among young people to become teachers. And we also, frankly, we see high numbers of young teachers, or novice teachers, as TALIS would call them, leaving the profession in the first couple of years. So there is a long-term challenge there in how we can guarantee that we have sufficient numbers of trained, qualified and motivated teachers to work in our schools. And I think we're looking at a really quite complex situation with a number of factors coming together. And I think we do need to acknowledge that issues around pay, working conditions and job security are always going to be part of the equation. It's going to be part of how attractive we perceive a profession to be, and it's going to be part of how possible it is for individuals to stay in that profession. At the same time, I think we're looking at a number of changing demands on the profession. We're looking at a number of changes also in terms of how young people, and maybe people more broadly, I guess there's a more philosophical level to this as well. How do we look at the world of work, and what kind of expectations do we have? How do we see the role of work in our lives? And TALIS has some really interesting data there around the motivations behind becoming a teacher, and the really large number of teachers who are in the profession for that sense of making a difference, for that having an impact on young people and generations to come, and thereby really helping build a better world. But in there, I think you also have issues around autonomy and agency, the extent to which teaching is seen as a profession where you as an individual can not just make a difference for the students you teach, but also make a difference at work in terms of your own conditions of work and being part of a team where there may be or may not be a lot of teamwork, support, and so on. And here I think TALIS offers a wealth of data to unpack.
Ruochen, to bring you back in, for those countries which are struggling with high numbers of young teachers leaving, but also have a relatively high average age of the workforce, what can be done in those contexts to try to make sure that young teachers do stay in the classroom and don't quit their jobs?
An important indicator that we look at in TALIS is how young teachers are allocated in classrooms throughout the country, or just how teachers are allocated in general. So in 2018, we did analysis that was based on what economists would call a Gini coefficient. So this is typically used to measure kind of how much wealth is concentrated in how few people in an economy. So what we looked at is the concentration of experienced teachers. So what percentage of schools employ what percentage of experienced teachers? So in the quote-unquote least equal countries, over half of the experienced teachers were teaching in just 10% of the schools. And when you look at the TALIS data, it suggests that teacher allocation policies typically favor seniority. So the more experience you have, you get quote-unquote first pick of where you wish to teach. And then you pick kind of better resource schools, smaller classes, etc. And then the schools where you don't want to teach, that's where the young novice teachers end up teaching. And that is probably one explanation of how you arrive at this highly clustered situation where a lot of experienced teachers are teaching in just a small comparatively number of schools. And that also, it feeds into questions of, okay, we talk about cooperation, we talk about mentorship, but in order for a novice teacher to be mentored, they need to have an experienced teacher at their school. Novice teachers can't mentor each other. So if all the experienced teachers are clustering in the same schools, that actually reduces the chances of mentorship.
I've got some of the data here so people have some examples. So Bahrain, Colombia, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates, in those places, the share of teachers under 30 who report working with students who have language difficulties is 15 percentage points higher than those of their older colleagues. So that's a very clear example there that in those countries, younger teachers are often finding themselves in much more demanding classrooms in regard to having to work with students with language difficulties. Antonia Wulff, to bring you in on this point, how do you tackle this?
How do we tackle this? Well, we work with the profession. And I think that's what's really key here. We know that those first few years of teaching, the first few years of any job, are hard. And there are all those difficulties you expected to encounter, and then there are all those very many difficulties you couldn't even imagine you'd be encountering. And I think part of the challenge here is that we do need solutions that cater to those individual challenges. Those solutions are expensive, and for cash-strapped governments, therefore, not coming across as the best solution. So going back to Ruochen's example of mentors, having a mentor is doing exactly that. That's somebody who works with you and can really engage with you on those difficulties you're encountering with that particular group of students. But that requires having those mentors. It also actually requires, and this is something we don't always spell out, it requires finding a way of carving out time for the mentors and compensating the mentors for that extra work that they are then doing. So really designing support interventions for teachers in those first couple of years, I think, is a key piece. Then there's another piece around collaboration more broadly and around school level collaboration, the pedagogical guidance and support from a school leader. To what extent are we supporting school leaders to do that? Are they sufficiently trained to provide some of that support as well?
I'm going to be slightly provocative, maybe, and say it is part of the issue that the nature of work is changing around the world, where people are working virtually or hybrid now. The expectation to go into work in one location every day is changing, and that particularly for young people, to go into a school system where they're expected to go to the same classroom every day, there's less appeal now to do that than there used to be, because there are so many other kinds of job options out there. And as a result of that, potentially, is it almost a losing battle? How can governments, policymakers fight back against that to ensure that, new people are coming in to work in the classroom? Ruochen.
Well, I think we would need a little bit more data to make sure that that potential explanation is true. To what extent are young teachers less interested in teaching because the hours are rigid, because it's not as flexible? It's possible. It's absolutely possible. But whether or not that is more important than some of the things that Antonia was talking about, salaries or working conditions, it's hard to say. And all of it could be related. And in different contexts, it could be, in fact, going in different directions. But we do have a little bit of empirical evidence, because now some education systems have embraced online education. We see in TALIS data, we just know that in Singapore, they practice home-based learning. So every 2 weeks, students and teachers stay home and they have school online, similar to what was happening during the pandemic, and they just maintained it. So that adds a little bit of schedule flexibility to teachers' livelihoods. At the same time, Singapore still has a fairly high level of novice teachers who wish to leave the profession.
Antonia Wulff, when you hear a policy idea like that, where, one day every 2 weeks, it would be virtual teaching, do you think that would catch on in many other countries or not?
Well, I think there's something to be said about the many contexts in which this has become a necessity because of different climate-related disasters. And in those cases, of course, it's a great opportunity and it's a great safety net to have the ability to do things online. But generally speaking, I think the pandemic taught us a lot about the centrality of human relationships and human connection. And I think very many teachers found that while parts of teaching and learning are easily transferable to an online environment, there are other parts that are really, really hard to transfer online. And that was actually one of the things that I was contemplating reading the TALIS findings, that, of course, observe an increase in online forms of continuous professional development for teachers. And TALIS doesn't comment on whether the online piece adds or subtracts quality, but that would be a question for me. Like, I wonder, it's obviously very attractive with these things that you can do at any moment in time, maybe. You can do them from wherever you are. And any policymaker who's excited about digital technology generally will opt for these. But what do we miss in terms of quality? And are there elements in some of the areas in which teachers were really asking for professional development that are actually hard to do online?
It's something that we certainly hear from pretty much every single teacher that we talk to. Teaching has absolutely an in-person component. And you lose something when it goes online or other mediums. I think it's important to recognize that we might be working with a certain level of inevitability, though. In 50 years, do we think that school or just life in general will be more remote or less remote? Probably more. To the extent that office workers are also working from home and teleworking, and this is becoming sort of an expectation, it is a little bit hard to expect kind of one very big part of society and life as we know it to remain separated from that global context. So I think the important question is what Antonia asked. What absolutely does need to be done in person? And that has several layers of nuance. If we're talking about education, we're probably also talking about the age of the child, whether or not the student has special education needs, the subject matter, all of those things I think can factor into a decision about what can be done online and what absolutely should be done in person. And I think teacher professional development, as Antonia mentioned, is a very good example, because historically, in TALIS data, we've seen that teachers who teach in rural areas receive less professional development than teachers who teach in urban areas, because they simply don't have the access. It costs more to go get training. They need more time. It's just much harder to coordinate. And of course, we also see that they're much more likely to do professional learning online because it gives them access that they previously didn't have. So they are certainly taking advantage of it. Whether or not the quality is the same as what they would receive on in person, for them is probably a moot point because they wouldn't even receive it in person.
Speaking of online teaching, I'm going to neatly segue into a technology-related other point. AI in the classroom. TALIS showed that a third of teachers are now using AI for work, most using it for planning lessons or learning about teaching topics. And out of those using AI, around a quarter are using it to assess or mark student work, which I think represents something of a fundamental shift. Is this a good development or a bad development? Antonia Wulff.
Well, I have to say that if I were to pick out a data point on AI, I'd pick the one around about half of teachers believing that we shouldn't use AI for teaching, which is quite a shockingly high number. And particularly, I think, for many policymakers who are very excited about all these all the many solutions that they think AI tools will bring into education. And I think this really, if I were a policymaker, I'd really zoom in on this and call a meeting with the unions, really try to meet with the profession to understand where does this come from and what does that mean for some of the policies that may already have been launched in whatever national context around the introduction of AI tools. I think there's a lot here that shows that teachers are eager to learn more about AI tools. They are eager to better understand how they can be introduced in a way that is pedagogically and ethically safe for both students and teachers. But for me, that 50% figure really stood out.
Yeah, Ruochen, on that point, is there an argument there that perhaps I shouldn't use the term gung-ho, but that policymakers are sort of pushing towards driving this AI train, but, a lot of the passengers, the teachers in this case, they're not on board with it?
I think everyone is pushing in every direction. November 30th, 2022 was less than 3 years ago. That's when ChatGPT was released to the public. And anyone who claims to kind of be a know-it-all expert in AI and education, I think is probably fooling themselves to some extent. And if they are an expert now, they will stop being an expert in about 6 months. So it's this question of, and I think this is where education, while it's constantly evolving, there are some kind of fundamental questions that we tend to revisit. And this is one of them, because I think the fundamental question is trust. When something new comes out, who trusts whom? Do education systems trust teachers to use that new thing? Do teachers trust education systems to tell them how to use it? And I think there's always a push and a pull, but in general, the idea that we're not shying away from it, I think, is a positive one. Neither teachers nor education systems are really shying away from artificial intelligence. They recognize that it's here to stay, and that ignoring it would certainly ignore a lot of potential. One very interesting finding in the TALIS data is, so in Singapore, where we launched TALIS, we were looking at their data related to artificial intelligence. So they are probably the absolute extreme in every sense. They use it the most. They receive the most training in it. They're the most hopeful about its potential, and they're also the most afraid about its consequences. So you can interpret that in many different ways. One interpretation is simply the more you learn about artificial intelligence, the more you realize what it can do, and the more you are worried about what it can do.
Very interesting. One of the figures there, I've got it in front of me. So reported teacher participation in AI training, the highest place in the world for this, for teacher participation in AI training, is Singapore. Like you say, 76%, 3/4 of teachers receive AI training in Singapore. The lowest is France, 9%. So like you say, there's a push and pull in different countries, Ruochen, there in regards to AI training. Antonia Wulff, how important do you think it is for teachers to engage with this?
No, of course. I mean, I take Ruochen's point that, of course, we should be open to new things. And when we discuss change in education systems, for sure, trust is a big piece. To what extent is the teaching profession trusted? To what extent is the profession trusting policymakers? However, I think when it comes to AI, we're dealing with a different category of change. And I think we're dealing with an element of unknown that is hard for all of us to navigate. And what we've seen so far is that a lot of the tools that are being suggested are actually tools that haven't originally been developed for education systems. They are tools that haven't had their quality assured by any public authority in that particular jurisdiction, which raises a very different kind of a trust issue, and which I think should raise some alarm bells as well. And I think that's also why teachers are eager to learn more and eager to better understand what's what. Why is it so important to use these tools? Is it really that these tools are going to respond to all of the issues we've been raising around the equity and the quality of our education systems? And what's the leeway for an individual teacher To what extent is an individual teacher able to determine which tools she uses in her classroom, if at all?
And if you want answers to some of those questions, or at least a debate in more detail about some of those questions, not to tout this podcast, but I am for once, is AI a superpower for the classroom? It's an episode of Top Class, our most popular episode of the last year or so, for obvious reasons. Everyone's talking about it, but you can check out that episode of Top Class where we really do get into those issues. We're running a little low on time, so I just want to quickly round up by looking ahead about what you think the priority should be for policymakers in the future, where TALIS has obviously gone over so many different data points, which we've really only touched on a few of them in this podcast. But what do you want policymakers to act upon the most, which has been raised by TALIS, where you think TALIS demonstrates that this is an area where new policy actions are needed? Ruochen.
Novice teachers. It's not a very fun answer. It's not a new technology. It's not AI, nothing like that. This has been something that's always been an issue. And I was kind of thinking about this to myself. Does novice teaching have anything particular about it versus novice engineering or novice accounting or novice anything else? Why do we kind of focus on this in a different way than we do in other professions? And taking off my TALIS hat, I think personally, something that strikes me is in most other fields, the experienced senior person has fundamentally a different set of responsibilities and expected outputs than the new junior person that just entered the field. Right? A senior partner at a law firm has different outcomes and outputs and responsibilities than the junior associate that just entered. They're working in the same law firm, but they're doing two very different things. And what they produce is going to be very different. A novice teacher has largely the same expected outputs and outcomes as an experienced teacher. They're teaching students. They want the students to learn. They want the students to become more skilled. And I think that's where it becomes very, very different, because to the extent that a novice lawyer has different circumstances, their office is smaller than the senior partner, etc. Their tax might be a little bit kind of seemingly more menial than the senior partner. But what they're trying to do at the end of the day is different. So you can make an argument that what they're working with and what they have to work with is suited to their demands. But a novice teacher and experienced teacher, they are trying to do the same thing. So when you give them an unlevel playing field on top of the fact that they are entering with less experience, you, I think, can create some real problems in the field of teaching.
Okay. And Antonia Wulff, what priority would you choose?
So I'd go for 3. The first one is the shortage. I think this is a cry for action to any education policymaker, and a reminder of a need to really sit down at the national level and look at what the shortage looks like and what the necessary actions are. The second one is around autonomy, and that's something we didn't touch upon so much in our conversation today. But I think what TALIS 2024 shows us is that professional autonomy, the extent to which a teacher feels respected and trusted to make decisions in her classroom, has a number of impacts on well-being and job satisfaction. And it's interesting because several times the report says something along the lines of like, oh, professional autonomy is not an aim in itself, but, and then comes some disclaimer. But I read the report thinking, here you actually prove that it is an aim in itself, because you have some great data around the link between professional autonomy and greater fulfillment of lesson aims, teachers trusting themselves and being able to adapt their teaching to that particular group of students. There's some great data around the links between professional autonomy and being more confident, teachers' self-efficacy. And there's some great data around professional autonomy and well-being. So having professional autonomy enhances teacher well-being. They are less likely to feel stressed. They are less likely to not have enough time for their personal lives, and they are less likely to report negative effects on their mental and physical health. I mean, this is pretty incredible. So I think there's an interesting invitation here for us as well to look at how professional autonomy can be ensured, enhanced, invested in, particularly in a context where teaching is increasingly politicized as well. And then my last one, I'm cheekily adding my third point here. There's something around policy influence where the TALIS data is really powerfully showing how having impact beyond your own school and feeling respected as a professional, being able to influence policy more broadly, how that also contributes positively to job satisfaction, well-being, and all of that. So again, a really clear invitation to policymakers to think about that one. How can we be better at involving teachers in policymaking?
Thank you, Antonia. And usually at the end of the podcast, I have to trail ahead to implore people to read the report which we've been discussing. But I think Antonia's done such a good job there by outlining how there are so many data points and insights in this TALIS report which we haven't barely covered, that you really do need to go online, the OECD website, OECD.org, check out the TALIS report. There's also an insights and interpretations brochure which breaks down some of the key findings. Loads more on there. Check it out, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it and engage in it as much as Antonia has, and Ruochen as well. Thank you so much to Ruochen, the OECD Senior Project Leader for the TALIS survey, and Antonia Wulff, Director of Research Policy and Advocacy at Education International. That is all we have time for. Subscribe to this podcast if you haven't already. And please do join us again for another top-class recording sometime soon. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.